Hello, my dear friend. How are you tonight? Where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to tap that like button so we can share more magical nights together. Now, make yourself comfortable, snuggle under your blanket, and let the world outside grow quiet. It's time to turn off the lights, take a deep breath, and let your mind drift into a land of dreams. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called Moana and the Lost Star. Now, close your eyes. Our journey begins. The island of Motunui had a way of slowing down at night, like it had decided that enough had happened for one day, and it deserved a long, quiet exhale. The waves rolled in with a lazy rhythm, brushing against the sand like a painter idly cleaning a brush. Moana sat cross-legged on the beach, toes sinking into the cool grains, feeling the tiny prickles where the water reached her. She had spent the day hauling nets, fixing a canoe with her father, and convincing the local chickens not to roost inside the village's food storage hut again. Now, the day's heat was gone, replaced by a soft breeze that tasted faintly of salt and hibiscus. Above her, the sky was a spill of glitter, a million pinpricks of light scattered across a canvas of deep blue velvet. Some stars were bold, others shy, peeking through only when the clouds shifted. The moon lounged high above, looking smug, as if it knew it was the real headliner. Moana tilted her head back and tried to spot familiar constellations. She recognized the one shaped like a fishhook, a gentle reminder of her old friend Maui, somewhere out there probably doing something ridiculous. She smirked at the thought. The island slept behind her. Somewhere, Pua the pig snored in his pen, making little grunting noises that sounded suspiciously like he was having a dream about sweet potatoes. The palm trees whispered in the breeze, telling secrets Moana didn't quite catch. A distant thump of a coconut hitting the ground made her wonder if Hey Hey had managed to climb a tree again. If so, that chicken was really pushing the limits of curiosity didn't kill the cat. The beach was her favorite place to be at this hour. The rhythm of the waves felt like the island's heartbeat, steady and reassuring. She dug her fingers into the sand and let it run between them, cool and dry on top, but warm and damp underneath, like the beach had been holding onto the day's sunlight just for her. Somewhere out on the horizon, a faint flicker caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a firefly, but it was far too bright. She sat up straighter, squinting. The flicker grew into a streak, a single thread of gold being pulled through the dark sky. It wasn't like the usual shooting stars she'd seen. This one seemed slower, heavier, as if it had second thoughts about where it was going. The streak descended toward the beach, cutting across the constellations with almost clumsy determination. The air felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm. The hairs on her arms stood up, and the waves seemed to hush, pulling back slightly as if to make space. Then came a soft hiss, followed by a muffled splash, just a short distance away near the place where the reef's edge met the sand. No dramatic explosion, no blinding flash, just arrival. Moana hesitated for only a moment before pushing herself to her feet. Her curiosity was a strong, stubborn thing. She'd once chased a glowing manta ray halfway across a lagoon, just to see where it was going. Now, her gaze locked on the spot, where the water still shimmered faintly. She walked toward it, her footprints dark against the pale sand. The breeze carried a strange scent, like warm metal and rain, entirely out of place in the salty night air. As she drew closer, the glow became clearer, an almost golden light pulsing just beneath the shallow water. It looked alive somehow, the way it brightened and dimmed, like breathing. Moana crouched, the water swirling around her ankles, and reached down. The glow spilled over her fingers as she touched it, and the warmth surprised her. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than any stone had a right to be after nightfall. She scooped it up carefully, cradling it in both hands. The thing was about the size of a coconut, smooth and round, but not entirely solid. It seemed to hum faintly, as though holding back a song. The glow intensified for a heartbeat, then dimmed again, and Moana had the oddest feeling it was aware. She chuckled softly under her breath. "Well, you're definitely not from around here," she murmured, though the night was otherwise empty. A wave rolled up, soaking the hem of her skirt, but she barely noticed. The stone or whatever it was rested in her palms, as if it belonged there. She could feel a gentle vibration against her skin, steady and soft, like the purr of a very content kitten. She glanced back at the village, wondering if she should wake someone. But then again, who would believe her? This wasn't the sort of thing you interrupted people's sleep for, unless you were prepared to explain it in detail. And she didn't have the details. Not yet. Instead, she sat down on the wet sand, cross-legged again, holding the warm, glowing sphere in her lap. The waves whispered close by, curling around her like they wanted to eavesdrop. She tilted her head, wondering why it felt so important to just wait. It was in that moment she thought she heard something faint. A sigh, almost, carried on the wind. She stilled, listening harder. Nothing. Then, just as she was about to chalk it up to the breeze, there it was again. The barest trace of a sound, like the tinkle of seashells clinking together underwater. She couldn't help but smile. Whatever this was, it had chosen her beach, her night, and she had a feeling that tomorrow, or maybe even in the next hour, her plans for a quiet evening were going to look hilariously optimistic. She ran her thumb over the surface of the sphere, and for a brief second, she swore the glow pulsed in response, as if saying hello. And that's when the night sky seemed to lean in, just a little, as though waiting to see what would happen next. The waves whispered their steady lullaby, while Moana sat there, the glowing sphere pulsing faintly in her hands. She'd seen many strange things in her life, talking demigods, boats with minds of their own, a giant crab obsessed with glitter, but this felt different, calmer, almost shy. She tilted her head back toward the spot in the sky where the streak had come from. The stars above blinked innocently, as if they had no idea what had just fallen out of their ranks. But she knew better. This was no drifting log or wayward lantern. As if on cue, the glow in her lap brightened, casting a soft golden wash over her arms and the sand around her. Moana squinted down at it, shading her eyes with one hand, which felt slightly silly considering it wasn't exactly the sun. Then, without warning, the sphere gave a tiny tremor, like it had sneezed. The sound that followed wasn't exactly a voice, but it wasn't just noise either. It was something in between. A lilting wind chime tone that seemed to curl straight into her mind rather than her ears. "Whoa," she breathed, more to herself than to the sphere. "Are you?" She trailed off, because really, where did you go with that question? Are you sentient? Are you lost? Are you secretly about to explode? The tones came again, gentler this time, each note distinct and ringing in the night air. Moana frowned slightly, not in annoyance but concentration. She didn't speak, whatever language this was. Still, something about the rhythm and pitch tugged at her, like the way you can tell someone's sad even when they're speaking in another tongue. The next note sounded almost worried. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to the kind of tone she might use with a scared animal. "It's okay," she murmured, rocking the sphere slightly in her hands as if that might be comforting. "You're safe here." Oh. For a moment the glow dimmed, like it was holding its breath. Then it brightened again, faintly at first, then with more confidence. The notes came quicker, now higher, lighter, and Moana had the oddest sense that it was trying to tell her something. Her mind flicked through the possibilities. Maybe it needed water, a snack. Did stars even eat? She snorted softly at the thought. "If you start asking for coconuts, I'm out," she whispered with a small grin. Then something clicked, not literally, but inside her. The rhythm of the tones was slowing, like a storyteller lowering their voice. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, and an image bloomed in her mind. A sea of black, pinpricked with countless lights, all shimmering in place except for one, a small one drifting downward. Her eyes flew open. "You fell," she murmured. It wasn't a question. The sphere pulsed once bright and quick, almost like a nod. Her thoughts raced. She didn't know much about the technical side of stars, aside from the fact that her grandmother had once told her they were the eyes of her ancestors watching over the ocean. If this one had fallen, well, it wasn't going to get back up there on its own. Another pulse. This time, the tone carried something heavier urgency. She didn't need to be fluent in celestial wind chime to understand. Whatever this was, it wasn't just lost. It was on a clock. Before sunrise? She guessed quietly. She had no way of knowing why she said it. Maybe the image in her mind had shifted, or maybe she'd caught a hint of worry in the sound, but the sphere answered with a softer, almost relieved chime. The sea breeze picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain even though the sky was still clear. Moana hugged the sphere gently to her chest, letting the warmth seep into her. She'd been on enough voyages to know that some problems didn't have easy answers, but she also knew that giving up before you even started was not an option. "All right," she said under her breath, as if the stars overhead might overhear and hold her to it. "We'll figure this out. I don't know how yet, but we will." The sphere answered with a low hum, softer now, as if settling into trust. The ocean lapped closer, like it wanted to be part of the conversation. The foam tickled her toes, and she could almost imagine it whispering in agreement, although it might have just been the tide doing its usual thing. Still, the timing felt suspicious. She cast a glance back at the village. Everyone would be asleep by now, and she wasn't about to go knocking on doors to explain that a piece of the night sky had fallen into her lap. No, this would take a more specific kind of help. The kind you didn't find in your average fishing village. Moana's mind was already ticking through the list of unusual friends she'd made. Some of them might actually be able to handle return a lost star before it fades out of existence. Others, well, she loved them, but they'd probably just suggest roasting it over a fire. For now, though, she stayed put. The breeze had cooled slightly, and the waves seemed to lean closer each time they rolled in, as if the ocean itself was curious about the glowing visitor. The sphere's light played over the ripples in the water, turning each crest into a spark of gold before it faded back into the blue-black. Moana brushed a bit of damp hair from her face and sighed. "Guess my night off is officially cancelled," she said quietly, though her lips curved into a smile. The sphere hummed again, and she could swear it sounded a little like gratitude. Somewhere far above them, the stars held their places, but Moana couldn't shake the feeling that a few of them were watching just a bit more closely than usual. Sand still clung to the glowing thing as if the beach were unwilling to let it go, the grains sparkling like sugar where the light touched them. It sat in Moana's palms with a gentle, confident warmth, the way a shell keeps the day's sun tucked inside for later. When she lifted it, she felt a soft hum near her wrists. Not sound exactly, but a vibration threading into her pulse, until both seemed to agree on a shared rhythm. Somewhere behind her, the village breathed deep in sleep, and the sea kept up its soothing percussion section, shh in, shh out, as if demonstrating proper bedtime technique. She looked again, at where she had first seen it half buried. Even now, the shallow indent remained, a round nest in the wet sand, its edges scalloped by the last few waves. The place smelled faintly of warm rain and seaweed, a scent that did not match the clear sky or the breeze, as if the air had borrowed perfume from some distant storm. Moana crouched to brush away the remaining crust of sand from the sphere, fingertips slow and deliberate, and the light brightened in polite thanks. If Beachstones gave out gold-level customer service, the island jewelry trade was doomed. She turned it carefully in her hands. Its surface was smooth like coral that had been polished for 100 tides, with no seam or crack to show how it had been made. But beneath that glassy skin, threads of brightness wound and crossed, then unwound again, like tiny rivers of dawn exploring their options. From certain angles, she could see constellations hiding there, star-lace patterns that shifted when she blinked. Each pattern lasted only a moment, then softened into something new, never repeating, like the ocean making up lullabies on the spot. Heat gathered where her fingers cupped the sphere, never too hot, just shy of perfect, the temperature of a sunlit rock at low tide. The warmth eased the soreness in her palms left over from the day's work. She rolled her shoulders, listening to the soft click where a knot untied itself in her back. Bedtime posture correction courtesy of an interstellar pebble. Somewhere, a bone setter would be filing a strongly worded complaint. She brought the sphere closer to her ear, not because she expected to hear anything in the usual way, but because it felt like the right ritual. The hum vibrated along her cheekbone, and she let her eyes drift half-closed. There was a suggestion of music inside it. Not notes exactly, but intervals, like the distances between stars converted into something a person could almost understand. It reminded her of the sound the wind makes at the mouth of a shell, except instead of the single tone of a hollow space, this was layered, a harmony made of very far places agreeing to sing softly together. A crab nosed out from beneath a humped ripple of sand, paused, raised its eye stalks toward the glow, and decided wisely that whatever this was did not belong in the category labeled potential snack. It shuffled sideways with dignity, the crustacean equivalent of pretending not to be impressed. Moana grinned. If the island's tiny cleanup crew was giving the object respectful distance, the situation was either very magical or very above the crab's pay grade, possibly both. She brushed the last damp grains from the sphere and noticed faint pricks of brightness bleeding out into the sand wherever it touched. The grains took the light as if they had been waiting, each tiny crystal catching a pin's worth of dawn and holding it a few heartbeats before letting it fade. She ran the sphere lightly over the sand to watch the effect again, small, safe, beautiful. A child's toy made by the night itself. Somewhere in the universe, she figured, a manager of cosmic effects had signed off on the sparkle budget with suspicious leniency. She rose and waded a step into the wash to see how the glow behaved over water. The next small wave swept around her ankles, cool silk against skin, and the light from the sphere spread across the surface. It did not scatter like sunlight. Instead, it traveled in lines that curved and braided, then darted toward the reef, as if following secret paths engraved on the sea. For a moment, she imagined old navigators following such lines, reading them like charcoal marks on a map. The thought warmed her more than the sphere did. She had always loved the idea that the ocean hid writing in plain sight. The sphere's patterns changed again. A ring of fine radiance traced itself inside the glassy skin, then another ring inside that, and another still, each one pulsing at a slightly different pace. It reminded her of the ripples from a tossed pebble, except the pebble was tossing itself over and over, inward rather than out. She thought of breathing exercises her grandmother used to tease her with slow-in, slower-out advice disguised as a bedtime dare. The sphere seemed to approve of this memory, the pulses aligning into something calmer, something regular. Good, then. They were learning each other's language one pulse at a time. Behind her, a gust stirred the palms, and a coconut plopped into the sand, with the resigned thud of someone who had tried very hard to stay in the tree and failed anyway. She glanced back on instinct, half expecting to see a certain chicken triumphantly perched on the fallen fruit, already composing a victory speech in clucks. No sign of the feathered menace. She issued the beach, a silent thank you for small mercies. The last thing tonight needed was a poultry versus celestial object incident report. Joke 1, neatly delivered by the island's quality control department. The glow intensified briefly, then softened, as if the sphere had caught her amusement and reflected it back. It did that, she noticed, with feelings in general, picked them up, tasted them, and returned a gentler version, like the way the lagoon returns a shout as a whisper. She tested the theory with cautious curiosity, and felt the hum brighten with a tone that read as, yes, exactly, curious is good. If the thing had cheeks, it would probably be smiling. Moana knelt and pressed the sphere back into the little nest where it had landed. The sand welcomed it again, curling like a warm blanket around its lower half. In the new position, the inner threads arranged themselves into a shape she recognized from nights on the water. A crooked hook of stars, cousins to the one she followed when steering by memory. The pattern hung there for a long, soft breath, then slowly rotated as though the sky were turning inside the glass. She set her palm lightly on top, happy to be the paperweight on a star chart no one else could see. Time, always slippery near the shoreline, thinned even further. The beach edge turned into a place where minutes stretched like taffy, and the surf kept combing its fringe. The sphere's warmth seeped into the sand, into her forearms, into the bones under her skin. Even the mosquitoes, usually passionate about their evening meal plan, gave this patch of coast a respectful berth. She made a note to market the glow as bug repellent right after she solved the part where it came from outer space. Business plan steps 1 and 2, easy. She lifted the sphere once more to study its underside. No cracks, no chips. A fine dusting of something like powdered starlight clung there, sifting off into the water with each breath of the tide. When it touched the sea, the dust did not dissolve. Instead, it became a brief, delicate pattern of dots. And she realized they arranged themselves into tiny echoes of islands. Motunui appeared first, then a scatter toward the horizon, a drifting archipelago that matched her mental charts with unnerving accuracy. The dots winked out one by one as the water lapped them, like lights going to sleep across the ocean. She leaned back on her heels, accepting the quiet amazement that flowed through her. The sphere was not a rock, not a jewel, not a lantern, and yet it shared truth with each of those things. It was also, unmistakably, a traveler. The way it tested the air, the way it mapped what it touched, the way it responded to a story remembered in the chest rather than the head, those were traveler's habits. She knew them because they were her own. Another thought arrived, with the gentle persistence of a small wave. The place where it had fallen might matter. The angle, the depth, what the sand had held there, even the last fragments of heat hidden in the grains. She scooped a little of the damp sand into her hand and brought it close to the glow. Tiny flecks within the sand brightened, as if peppered with moon shards, then settled back to ordinary. She smiled at the small theatre of it. The beach was ready to be a stage tonight. Luckily, it had excellent lighting. She stood, careful and deliberate, and cradled the sphere against her. The night made room for them with that easy generosity the island kept for those who listened. She felt a slow, contented yes inside her ribs, and the hum inside the sphere answered in kind. Whatever came next could wait the length of another wave, maybe two. For now, discovery itself was enough. And if anyone asked why she was padding along the tide line, cuddling a ball of condensed star glow, she would simply say she was doing important research into beach illumination standards. Joke 3 logged, credibility intact, bedtime vibe maintained. The ocean breathed in, the ocean breathed out. The sphere glowed like an ember from the hearth of the sky, and the sand, patient, generous, slightly smug, held their footprints as if keeping a gentle record of the first steps of a friendship. The night had settled into that half-dreaming stage where even the ocean seemed to be humming under its breath. Moana sat with the sphere nestled in her lap, her hands cupped loosely around it, letting the glow spill between her fingers like warm water. The breeze tugged lightly at her hair, teasing strands into her face, and somewhere a gecko made a tiny clicking noise, as if trying to get her attention. She ignored it, not because she didn't like geckos, but because she suspected it was just there for moral support and maybe to judge her posture. Then, without warning, the sphere spoke. Not in the chimes and hums from before, this was a real voice. Soft and high, so light it was almost part of the wind. I lost my way. Moana froze, her gaze snapping down to the glowing orb. You talk, she said slowly, the way one might point out that the coconut you've been carrying is actually a sea urchin. Yes, the voice replied, hesitating between syllables as though tasting them. I fell too far. I cannot climb back. The words were simple, but the sadness threaded through them was unmistakable. Moana felt her chest tighten, the way it did when she saw a baby turtle heading in the wrong direction toward the forest instead of the sea. What are you? She asked gently. I am a star. The answer came without a hint of pride, just fact. I live up there. The sphere pulsed softly, and Moana's gaze followed the light up into the great sprawl of constellations above. For a moment, she could almost picture a small empty space where one should have been, a gap in the pattern. You fell from the sky, she murmured, half to herself. Yes. The sphere's glow dimmed as it spoke. If I am not home by dawn, I will fade. Fade. The word landed in Moana's mind with more weight than it had any right to carry. Not disappear, not vanish, fade. That meant to still exist, but without brightness, without presence. And for a star, wasn't brightness everything? She thought of the sunrise, of how quickly the first light burned away the night. Dawn wasn't far off. So we have a few hours, she said. already shifting into the problem-solving mode that had gotten her through more than one near disaster. "I do not know the way back," the star confessed. Moana tilted her head, brushing her thumb over the sphere's surface in slow circles. "Then we'll find someone who does." The star's pulse quickened, like a heartbeat skipping with hope. "You will help me?" Moana smirked because it wasn't really a question. "Of course. Helping is kind of my thing." Then she added, "Also, you landed in my favorite spot. That's practically a signed contract." The star let out something that was almost a laugh, if a laugh were made of wind through shells. Still, Moana couldn't help, glancing toward the horizon. The dark line of the ocean stretched endlessly, and above it the sky seemed impossibly far away. Even if she had a canoe ready, you couldn't just sail to the stars. Well, not without very, very good company. She thought of Maui. He could turn into a hawk and maybe, just maybe, carry the star high enough. But Maui wasn't exactly a just drop in for a chat kind of person. Then there were the other friends she'd made on her travels, each as unusual as the next. She'd have to be smart about who she called. For now, she focused on keeping the star calm. Its glow brightened when she kept her hands steady and her voice low. So she talked about the island, how the breadfruit trees had been heavy with fruit that year, how Pua had decided to chase crabs for sport, how the sunset sometimes looked like the whole sky had been painted with guava juice. The star listened, its pulses syncing to the cadence of her words. The rhythm reminded her of rocking in her canoe at night, the ocean swaying in time with her own breath. "You're not heavy," she said after a while. "That's good. Easier to carry you around." "I am small," the star admitted, "but I am bright." "Understatement of the century," Moana muttered. And the star gave that airy little laugh again. She leaned back on her hands, looking up at the sky once more. If she could just figure out the pattern of where the star had come from, maybe she could guide it back. But time was short, and stars weren't like misplaced coconuts. You couldn't just climb a tree to fix it. The waves hissed and curled at her toes, as if they were waiting for their cue to join in. Maybe they knew something she didn't. Maybe the ocean could carry messages farther than any voice could reach. Moana's mind was already whirring with plans. She'd need allies, and maybe a little magic. The star shifted slightly in her lap, the way a child might when they're not sure if they're safe yet. Moana cupped it again, firm and steady. "Don't worry, we'll get you home before the sun wakes up." Above them, the rest of the stars kept their places. But Moana had the strange feeling that somewhere in the far dark, a constellation had leaned in to listen. Dawn had a way of making promises from very far off, a thin silver rumour along the horizon that did not yet exist, but somehow had everyone preparing anyway. The beach knew it, smoothing itself with gentler waves. The palms knew it, rustling like someone tidying a room before guests. Even the moon, lounging like a lifeguard with tenure, seemed to lower its bright clipboard and glance east. Moana watched that edge for a long breath, then looked down at the small star warming her hands. The little voice came again, as light as wind travelling through a shell, and Moana understood what it kept repeating. Before the first stitch of morning touched the ocean, it had to be home. Not later, not nearly, not the fashionable kind of late clouds get away with when they arrive wearing gold after sunrise. Before. The word shaped the rhythm of her breathing, urgency on the inhale, patience on the exhale, until her chest and the surf agreed on a steady pace. She asked what fading truly meant, not with big questions, but with a listening stillness and the soft pressure of her palms. The answer arrived as images braided into feeling. The star showed itself thinning in the wrong way, not bright but pale, the way writing washes off a shell after too many waves. Its stories, night songs, secret paths only starlight knows. The long-distance hello between distant worlds would loosen and drift like unknotted rope. It would not hurt, the star made clear. It would simply be almost sank behind Moana's ribs like a small anchored ache. She had watched driftwood surrender to mulch in the shallows and seen bright fish lose colour when carried too far from the reef. Things belonged in their homes, even brave things. She held the star closer. The glow thickened, warm as honey in a spoon, as if trust itself had weight and had chosen her lap for a moment. She told it without speeches how sailors on Motunui read twilight, counting heartbeats between the last red on the clouds and the first true dark. The star steadied beneath her touch, yet threads of brightness still slipped and tangled across its surface like anxious fish in a net. If anxiety were a sport, she decided, she would still pick canoeing, because canoeing came with better snacks. The thought tugged one corner of her mouth upward. The star's hum lifted in reply, proving that feelings were a language they could trade without a dictionary. She took inventory the way a navigator cannot help doing. A scatter of shells glowed like little moons. Dark knots of seaweed curled into punctuation. The patient reef pretended to sleep while listening to everything. On a different night, she would have named constellations. Tonight, she counted minutes by edge, sounds. The first bird clearing its throat in the palms, a crab shutting down its tiny night market, the breeze turning from warm land breath to cool sea breath, as if someone had flipped a tide timetable. What could be done with only a beach, a canoe not yet slid to the waterline, and a star that needed a stairway to the sky? Motunui owned no ladder long enough. There were ropes, yes, but the sky was an uncooperative anchor point. She pictured tying a bowline in a cloud, and almost laughed. Almost. If dawn came with a snooze button, she would have pressed it twice and left a hibiscus sticky note requesting a reschedule due to celestial maintenance. The star pulsed in tiny amusement. At least humor still traveled. Another thread of meaning unspooled from the star, and she caught it, like a shell passed across a tide pool. Fading, it explained, was forgetfulness, a soft unmaking. The fear was not pain, but the loss of memory, the roots etched into darkness, the way comets gossiped across black distance, the home patterns of constellations that kept the night stitched tight. To show her, the star painted a miniature chain of islands inside its glow. The dots flickered, separated, and went ghost, soft, like towns going early to sleep. She answered with a modest story of her own. Once she had doubted the ocean and herself, and the invitation hidden just beyond the horizon. Listening had changed that. One gentle push from living water had set her on a path exactly her size. She did not crown herself hero. Bedtime does not require capes, only neighbor, the kind who shows up with a canoe, a coil of rope, and a stubborn agreement with hope. The star warmed at that, light steeping like afternoon tea. Around them, the island adjusted in ways only late watchers notice. The sand cooled a shade. The reef's hush braided in a faint metallic thread, a distant bell stitched into surf. Moana drew her knees up and let the star settle into the hollow there, making a small nest of bone and promise. Fear did not leave. Fear curled up politely in a corner and agreed to be quiet for a while. That counted as progress in any language worth learning. She sifted through risks and resources, that old traveling habit, waking like a helpful bird and tilting its head. Perhaps the way forward was reflection. If the ocean could be turned into a perfect mirror, the sky might accept the return, the way a door recognizes its own shape. The ancient reef came to mind, the one elders said could show the heavens even on a clouded dusk, because its stones had memorized the constellations in their bones. Reefs with excellent memory were her favorite kind. She set that idea aside where she kept promising maps. Another thought arrived on a slow wave. She did not have to do this alone. The notion was so obvious she had to smile at herself. She had friends whose days were shaped by unusual problems, people for whom the words impossible and Tuesday were occasionally interchangeable. The world beyond Motunui felt a fraction nearer, the way the sea leans in when it has something to say. She did not call out yet. Comfort first, logistics second. The heart needed settling before strategy could stand. She calmed the star the way she calmed. A nervous canoe hand flat, pressure steady, voice soft enough to blend with the surf. Remember, her touch said, how the ocean moves you without taking you apart. Remember that the sky still has a space shaped like you. The star answered with a low ribbon of tone that braided through her breathing. The braid felt strong enough to lean on, the kind of strength that wears slippers rather than boots. They listened then. To island, to reef, to the maybe, morning waiting somewhere offstage. Moana carried the star to the water's edge and let the wash run over her ankles. When foam kissed the sphere, tiny constellations skittered across its surface as if the sea were cradling the sky's reflection and rehearsing a lullaby. The star brightened at that practice, as though remembering that ascent often begins with reflection. She promised without ceremony that they would find the right surface, the right path, the right moment. To keep herself from counting seconds like a nervous metronome, she offered the night a third gentle joke. If nothing else worked, she would file official paperwork with the Department of Cosmic Traffic, requesting an emergency extension on darkness for repairs. Somewhere inside the warmth, she felt the star smile. Humor, she thought, was a rope you could throw even when your hands were too small for ladders. Dry sand welcomed them back with a sigh. Moana set the star upon the little nest where it had first landed. The imprint looked like punctuation now, a comma rather than a period. Pause, do not stop. The horizon stayed dark, but the sense of a line being drawn just out of sight had sharpened countdown, but kindly. She smoothed the sand around the sphere and drew a circle with her fingertip, a sailor's habit, making a small home inside the larger one until the sky opened its highest door. She lifted her gaze to the crooked hook of stars and felt steadiness return to her shoulders. Before dawn, she repeated inside her chest, a vow in the same category as bring everyone home or fix the sail in a squall. Not a threat, a task. The star felt the shape of that promise and settled, a stovecoal banked for travel. Soon, she would call for help. For this quiet moment, she would keep watch beside it, counting the heartbeats between the last word of night and the first syllable of morning while the sea hummed, patient and sure. Moana stood, brushing sand from her legs, the glowing star cradled against her side. The plan, or at least the seed of one, was taking shape. If there was one thing she knew about saving lost things, it was that you never did it alone. You needed the right crew, people who wouldn't blink when you told them the situation involved, returning a small sentient ball of light to outer space before sunrise. Now, the fastest way to summon that kind of help wasn't by messenger canoe or village meeting it, was by trusting that the ocean had a good sense of humor about urgent favors. Moana stepped into the shallows, feeling the warm, foamy water swirl around her ankles. Okay, she said quietly to the waves. You know who I need. The star pulsed curiously in her arms, and Moana gave it a small, knowing smile. Don't worry. My friends are unconventional, but they get results. As if on cue, a faint chime rang from the reef, too crisp to be the call of any local bird. A moment later, a patch of water nearby began to freeze. Thin tendrils of frost curled across the surface like silver vines, spiraling toward shore until they solidified into a perfectly circular raft of ice. Standing on it, grinning as though this was completely normal, was Olaf. "Moana!" the snowman called, waving with both stick arms and wobbling precariously. "Your ocean sent me an invite, which is weird because I don't usually get invites to beaches. Something about helping a glowy coconut?" Moana chuckled, wading out to meet him. "Not a coconut. A star. And yes, I need your help." Olaf leaned forward to peer at the sphere. His twig eyebrows climbed. "Oh, you're shiny and warm and not melting me. This is very confusing for my snow-related worldview." The star gave a shy, airy hum. Olaf clapped his twig hands together. "So, how do we get you back up there? I assume not by jumping really high. Although, if we get enough reindeer..." "No reindeer," Moana interrupted with a smile. "We need a way to reach the sky. Fast." Olaf tapped his snowy chin in exaggerated thought. "Have you considered building a snow ladder?" Moana blinked. Snow ladder? Sure. Snow is very cooperative if you stack it right. I've always thought that if I made one tall enough, I could wave at clouds." He glanced at the ocean. "Granted, I've never tested this theory over water. Or at all." Moana laughed softly. "I admire your optimism, Olaf. But snow doesn't exactly survive tropical climates." True," Olaf admitted, looking slightly deflated though in his case. That just meant sinking half an inch into his icy raft. Then he brightened. "But I can make ice platforms. We could stack them, like steps. The star pulsed faintly, as if intrigued by the idea. Moana considered it. The problem wasn't the concept, it was the time. Even if we could, she said, building them would take too long, and we have maybe a few hours before sunrise. Olaf nodded solemnly. Right. That's not a lot of time. Although I once learned how to tap dance in 2 hours, and while it didn't help me reach the moon, it did make me very popular with penguins. The star's hum wavered in what Moana suspected was a laugh. She crouched beside Olaf's icy platform. We might still use your ice. Maybe not for climbing, but as part of a reflection. If we can create a surface clear and still enough to mirror the sky perfectly, it could connect the star back to its home. Olaf's twig arms flailed in excitement. Ooh, like a magic ice mirror. I can do that. Ice is kind of my thing. Moana smiled. I know. But we'll need more than ice. We'll need someone who knows exactly where this star belongs. The star's glow warmed in her hands, as though it understood the importance of that detail. Moana stood and looked out toward the horizon, the breeze tugging at her hair. We'll need Stitch. Olaf tilted his head. Stitch, the small blue thing who eats everything? That's the one, Moana said with a smirk. But he's also a genius with maps. If anyone can figure out where this star came from, it's him, Olaf perked up. Okay, how do we call him? Does he have like a seashell phone? Moana grinned at the memory of Stitch's communications device, which, last time she'd seen it, was part walkie-talkie, part sandwich press. Something like that. She crouched near the tide and traced a simple pattern in the wet sand, a spiral that looped twice before curling inward. The moment she finished, the ocean foamed up over it, erasing the lines. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, far out beyond the reef, something broke the surface with a loud splash. A small blue figure shot into the air, riding a surfboard made of glowing, translucent light. Did someone say snacks? Stitch yelled, clearly misunderstanding the situation. Moana shook her head with a laugh. Not snacks, Stitch. Stars. He landed neatly on the sand, sniffed the air, and eyed the glowing sphere in her arms. His large black eyes reflected its light perfectly. Ooh, sparkly. How? The star pulsed faintly, and Stitch tilted his head, listening. Then, without being told, he pulled a small, flickering holographic projector from somewhere in his fur and tapped it. A swirl of blue and gold light appeared in midair, tiny points, forming a star chart. Moana felt a grin spread across her face. I knew you'd know what to do. The night had just gotten a lot more hopeful. Stitch's holographic map hovered above the sand like a strange, glowing jellyfish. Points of light blinked and shifted as he adjusted it, each flicker mapping some corner of the sky in miniature. The star in Moana's arms pulsed in recognition, tiny golden ripples shimmering across its surface whenever one of the chart's constellations matched a memory. See? Easy, Stitch muttered in his scratchy, smug way, his claws dancing over the device. Find pattern, find position, send sparkly home. Oh. Olaf leaned closer to the map, accidentally stepping into it and scattering a handful of projected stars across the beach. Oh, I made a constellation of my own. Look, this one looks like a snow shovel. It's upside down, Stitch replied flatly, swatting at the drifting light dots until they snapped back into place. Moana knelt beside the projection. This is incredible, Stitch. Can you pinpoint where our friend here came from? Stitch's ears twitched, and he pulled up a specific section of the chart. Maybe, but it's far. High. Sky stuff, not beach stuff. He tapped the device again, and a single star blinked a little brighter than the rest. Here. The little star in Moana's arms let out a soft, relieved hum, its glow warming her hands. She didn't need a translator to know that was home. Now we just have to figure out how to get you there before dawn, Moana said, glancing toward the horizon. The sky still wore its deep indigo, but a faint light was beginning to tease the edge of the sea. Olaf raised a twig finger. Ice ladder? Moana chuckled. We might still use your ice, Olaf, but we'll need more than steps. We need a way to connect this spot to that exact place in the sky. Stitch was already ahead of her. He sketched a crude diagram in the sand with a claw, a star, a glowing surface beneath it, and a line shooting upward like a slingshot. Then he jabbed at Olaf's feet. Ice. Flat. Shiny. Big. Olaf gasped dramatically. You want me to make the world's largest ice rink? Yes, Stitch said simply. Moana nodded. If we can create a perfect mirror of the sky and place our star on it at the right angle, maybe it'll act as a bridge or a door back home. Oh, the little star pulsed brighter at the word home. All right, Olaf said, straightening up with all the pomp of someone about to take on a noble quest. Step 1, make ice. Step 2, don't fall on my face. Step 3, save the universe. Step 4, snacks after. Stitch added without looking up. Moana grinned. Let's get to work. They moved quickly. Olaf waddled down to the water's edge and began freezing a wide, perfectly smooth sheet of ice, his round body spinning like a clumsy figure skater as he went. The ocean, ever cooperative with Moana, stilled its surface enough for the ice to grow evenly. Each breath, Olaf took released a small cloud of frosty mist that drifted lazily away. Meanwhile, Stitch calibrated his projector, aligning the map with the actual night sky above. He muttered to himself in his alien language, which Moana had learned to mostly interpret as "it's working" or "I'm hungry." Moana kept the star close, occasionally holding it toward the sky to watch how its glow shifted in response to certain constellations. Each time it recognized something, it hummed softly, like a traveler pointing out familiar landmarks on the road home. Before long, Olaf's ice sheet gleamed in the moonlight, stretching far enough that Moana could see the whole sky mirrored in its glassy surface. It was almost disorienting, like standing between two identical worlds. Okay, Stitch said, snapping the projector off and pointing toward the ice. Place sparkly in center. Quick. Moana stepped carefully onto the ice, her bare feet slipping slightly before she adjusted her balance. Olaf hurried to her side, offering his stick arm like a proper escort. Careful. I've seen what happens when people fall on ice. It's mostly flailing and regretting. She reached the center, the little star pulsing faster in her hands now, as though it could feel the moment arriving. Gently, she set it down on the exact spot Stitch indicated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ice began to glow, not with Olaf's usual frosty shimmer, but with the golden warmth of the star's own light. The reflection beneath it deepened, stretching upward until it looked less like ice and more like an open window into the night sky. The star hummed in delight, its glow expanding until Moana had to step back. Olaf gasped. It's working. But just as the light began to form a solid path upward, a cold gust of wind swept over the beach, rattling the palms and sending small cracks across the ice. Uh-oh, Stitch said, his ears flattening. Not good. Moana looked toward the horizon. Clouds were gathering, dark and low, swallowing the stars one by one. We're losing the reflection. The star's hum wavered, and Moana could feel its warmth flickering in her hands. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be as simple as stepping into a mirror. They would need to move fast or risk the little star fading forever. Clouds muscled in from the horizon, swallowing stars as neatly as a curtain being tugged across a stage. The ice mirror sighed with hairline cracks, and the reflection wobbled, as if the night had suddenly remembered it had somewhere else to be. Moana steadied the small star against her chest and felt its warmth flicker, a quick, uncertain heartbeat of gold. She told it without speeches, the way a hand on her shoulder can deliver a promise that they weren't done, not by a long shot. Stitch crouched beside the failing mirror, ears canted like sails finding wind. His projector threw a calmer sky onto the beach, a hovering dome of blue and gold points, crisp and steady, even while the real heavens went shy. The light from his map brushed the sand in pale ripples and painted Olaf's snowy face a moonlit grey. Fine grains glittered where the projection crossed them, as if the beach was trying on a galaxy for size. The little star answered the map with a quiet pulse, a wind bell syllable that meant, yes, home is somewhere inside that lace. Stitch, delighted, began to tune the display the way a navigator tunes a sail, two claws working the device, with the economy of a creature who knows exactly which button actually does something and which one is there purely for decoration. First light joke of the night. His gadget still had fewer buttons than the average coconut, which, to be fair, comes with at least 3 very unhelpful ones. He marked a cluster, a crooked, delicate chain tucked near a brighter curve, like a necklace layered against a collarbone of dark. Parallax measures whispered in the glow. He shifted the dome, nudged the beach, sky by a degree, and there it was, an empty space, the size of a held breath. The star brightened at that gap, the way a traveler brightens at the sight of a familiar doorway. Even Olaf felt it, a little inhale of awe that fogged the night air in a soft puff, and briefly applied for a part-time job as a weather app. Joke 2, respectfully filed. Moana kept the pacing slow, the way a bedtime narrator drizzles honey rather than pours it. She asked the map questions the way a sailor asks the wind what path, what angle, what kind of door opens for a light that fell. Stitch's answer came as sketches in sand. A line from foam to sky. A lens made not of ice but memory. A place where rock remembered stars. He tapped his claw over the reef icon he had etched, then circled it with confident loops, announcing in the universal language of emphatic doodles that the ancient reef would do what their improvised mirror could not. The thought tasted right in Moana's chest. The reef elders spoke of a crescent of stone whose ridges memorized constellations the way bark keeps storms, the way old nets keep the shape of 100 fish would hold a reflection even if the clouds threw tantrums. She pictured the rhythmic pools there, those perfect bowls where water settled and then fell still, smooth as lacquer. If the sky needed a face to recognize itself in, those bowls were the quiet kind of face that did not blink. The small star, listening, warmed in agreement. Threads of brightness braided across its surface, settling into the pattern Stitch had pulled from the map. It did not speak much. It did not have to. Its glow collected itself the way a traveler squares a pack before a climb. Olaf, ever the team's enthusiastic morale officer, promised a fresh finish on the reef pools the moment they arrived. He would lay a thin glaze where needed, a calm skin of ice no thicker than a dragonfly's wing, just enough to tame a ripple. He said this with the solemnity of a craftsman who knows his role, and the unfiltered glee of someone who has just discovered that tropical microclimates can in fact be persuaded to cooperate if you flatter them. He made a small practice swirl near his feet. The ice shimmered, obedient and temporary, a shimmer that tinkled like glass when the tide kissed it. The ocean approved. It does enjoy good stagecraft. Stitch kept calibrating. He pulled the dome down until it hovered a handspan above the star, then moved it in slow arcs so the projection and the star could talk in private. Data whispered through that narrow space. Patterns and distances translated into comfort. He flagged 3 alignment windows before dawn, each a short corridor of minutes when sky and reef and breath would agree. He also flagged a 4th window that was technically after dawn, then crossed it out with theatrical disgust, because no one needed that kind of optimism right now. Moana took those windows and laid them alongside tide tables she knew by muscle memory. The first alignment would intersect a low surge at the reef. They would need to reach the stones before the sea decided to test their commitment. The second window was safer for waves, but so close to first light it would require a perfect setup. And bedtime stories did allow suspense but frowned on reckless brinksmanship. The third window looked best. Enough darkness to anchor stars, enough lull in the sea to set a mirror without a tremor. The plan assembled itself with gentle clicks. Stitch would hold the sky dome steady over the chosen pool. Olaf would glaze the surface just long enough to quiet it. Moana would set the star at the exact center of the reflection, hands steady, breath slower than the tide. At the moment the map and the heavens aligned, the reef's memory would reach up and the star would step onto its place as if a staircase had always been there, only shy until invited. They rehearsed the motions on the sand because practice is a lullaby's cousin. Moana mapped her footwork between shells like a dancer learning a soft routine. Stitch timed his projector sweeps to the steady inhale, exhale of surf. Olaf counted aloud in the measured rhythm of a bedtime storyteller, which conveniently matched his preferred tap dancing tempo. The star watched, pulses small and regular, like a heart choosing trust over panic one beat at a time. The wind frisked the palms and then settled, ashamed of earlier dramatics. The late-night gecko offered moral support from a rock and refrained from critiquing anyone's stance. A brave crab ventured near and reconsidered, paging its union representative about potential overtime on magical cleanups. Joke 3. Signed by the beach's Labour Relations Committee. Because details matter, Stitch made tiny adjustments to Moana's canoe long before they pushed it. A quick lash here, a borrowed glow panel there to give them a soft, steady light that wouldn't scare the reflection, a calibrated line on the bow that would point directly at the reef's heart when the canoe rode a certain swell. He tucked the projector into a sling across his chest and tested its beam against a palm trunk. The leaves became a brief constellation of their own, then settled back into ordinary leafness with dignified rustles. Moana wove a temporary cradle for the star from a strip of sailcloth and a length of well-travelled rope, the fibres smelling faintly of salt and sunshine and the last storm she had mended through. She lined the cradle with a bed of dry pandanus, all soft rustle and clean sweetness, because some travellers need pillows, even when they glow. The star nestled there, brightness tamped to a calm ember so it could rest on the way. Every so often it sent a timid hum that pressed against her palm like a sleepy nod. They ate small things, banana halves, a shared sliver of coconut sweet as late laughter, a square of dried seaweed that Stitch stole, criticized, and then finished anyway. Moana laughed under her breath about the coconut's earlier demotion from star category, and the star replied with a playful pulse, as if to say, no offense taken. It was nice to be mistaken for a local delicacy rather than a cosmic emergency. Humor loosened the last knots that fear had left behind. The beach kept the mood gentle. Foam trimmed the shoreline in lace. The air held that cool, minty edge islands borrow just before dawn decides whether to get out of bed. The cracked ice mirror near the reef mouth melted back into the sea without complaint, a lesson in impermanence that felt kinder than usual. Overhead, a patch of sky reopened, and a handful of stubborn stars peered through like neighbours, checking whether the party was still going. They would be useful witnesses later, when the night would need to remember how brave it had been. Everything was ready, except the going, and going would be the next part of the story, not this one. Stitch marked their chosen alignment window on the sand with 3 careful dots and a little arrow that pointed seaward, more talisman than diagram. Olaf patted the star's cradle the way one pats a friend's shoulder before a test. Moana stood and let her breath lengthen until it matched the oceans again. The map hung above them one last time, a low, quiet dome. Inside it, the empty space. The place shaped like their small companion waited with a patience Moana admired. She told the map thank you, the way one thanks a lantern for sharing a path instead of trying to walk it for you. Then she folded the gratitude into the stillness that Bedtime prefers, tucking the promise down deep so it would be where she could find it when the reef rose to meet them. Clouds sulked farther out now, less certain of their performance, as if they remembered that some nights belong to returns. The tide tilted minutely toward lull. The horizon held off its silver, plans steadied into readiness. The ancient reef, invisible from here, felt somehow awake in her bones, like an old friend who had heard its name whispered and was already clearing a place at the table. The canoe cut through the dark water like a slow brushstroke, each dip of Moana's paddle pulling the night along with it. The air out here was thicker with salt, and every breath felt like sipping from a cup of the ocean's own making. Stitch crouched at the bow, projector harnessed across his chest. Its glow dimmed to a gentle heartbeat so it wouldn't outshine the sky. Olaf, perched in the middle with his little twig hands gripping the sides, looked at the blackness beneath them with a mix of awe and mild panic. "This is nice," Olaf said, leaning slightly over the edge to peer into the water. "Although I do feel like we're paddling into the world's biggest bathtub and someone forgot to install a drain." Stitch grunted without looking back. "No drain. Good. Keeps water in." "Oh." Moana smirked, but kept her stroke steady, steering by the faint silhouette of the reef ahead. The ancient crescent barely broke the surface tonight, its teeth of stone showing just enough to hint at the pools tucked inside. It wasn't the most welcoming sight in the dark, But she knew those same stones carried more stories than any library stories in their grooves, in the way the tide wore them, in how they reflected the sky. The star rested in its sailcloth cradle at her feet, glowing faintly. Moana glanced down at it every so often, reassured by its steady light. "We're almost there," she murmured. The star pulsed once, soft and trusting. As they neared the reef, the sea shifted beneath them. The swell grew quieter, more deliberate, as though the ocean itself were tiptoeing into a sacred place. The slap of water against the canoe softened to a muted kiss, and Moana could hear the subtle gurgle of water threading through the coral channels. They found the natural break in the crescent, a narrow gap where the canoe could slip inside without scraping. Beyond it, the lagoon spread out like a bowl of polished obsidian, its surface almost perfectly still. Even Olaf's snowflake breath seemed to hover above the water before dissolving. Moana let the canoe drift, letting the reef decide where to take them. The tide's slow push carried them toward the largest of the pools, a wide, circular basin whose walls curved inward just enough to keep the water still. Even under the faint light, Moana could see how smooth its surface was, like someone had skimmed it with glass. "This is it," she said softly, grounding the paddle against the stone edge. Stitch hopped onto the coral with ease, projector in hand. Olaf followed, wobbling only once before regaining his balance. An impressive feat considering coral wasn't exactly built for snowmen. Moana lifted the cradle and stepped out last, her bare feet finding the small ridges she'd learned to trust over the years. The pool's surface was already reflecting the stars overhead, but Stitch's projection gave it a sharper edge. He positioned himself so the dome of light settled perfectly over the basin, then fine-tuned the angle until the reflection inside matched the one above minus the small gap that belonged to their little star. Olaf crouched at the pool's edge, blowing a slow stream of frosty air across the water. A delicate skin of ice spread outward, thin enough to see through but smooth enough to erase the faint ripples that had been clinging to the surface. "There," he whispered, shiny as a mirror in a fancy castle. Moana lowered the star toward the center of the pool. Its glow seemed to lean toward the reflection, as if recognizing its own place in the pattern. The hum it gave off now was different, fuller, carrying both longing and a kind of joy. But before it touched the water, a small wave rolled in from the lagoon, subtle but strong enough to shiver the ice. The reflection wobbled. The star's light faltered. "Not yet," Stitch said sharply, checking the time on his device. "Too early. Wait for the window." Moana straightened, still holding the star. She could feel its pulse quickening, its warmth rising like the nervous heat before a race. "We can't wait too long," she reminded him, eyes flicking toward the horizon. "I know," Stitch replied, his ears angling toward the sky. Almost. Almost. The three of them stood there in the stillness, the reef holding its breath. The tide eased back, pulling the last small ripples out to sea. Above them, the clouds that had threatened earlier thinned just enough to let the full constellation show. Stitch's projector beeped softly. Now, Moana knelt and placed the star gently onto the center of the ice. For a moment, nothing happened, just the reflection of the sky, the dome's glow, and the small, perfect light resting between them. Then the ice beneath it began to shimmer, the glow deepening until the water looked like an open well to another world. The reflection of the constellation above stretched downward, and the star's light followed, pulling itself into the mirrored sky below. The pool became a doorway, but not a loud or violent one, more like a curtain of silk, parting in a slow breeze. The star pulsed once more, brighter than ever, and Moana felt the warmth slip from her hands as it began to rise, not upward, but inward, toward its place in the pattern. They were doing it, and then a shadow moved across the reflection. Something was in the water. The shadow that crossed the mirrored pool did not belong to a shark or a manta or anything with an expiration date. It belonged to a dozen tiny someones, each no larger than Moana's thumb and lit from within like glowworm lanterns. They zipped through the water with hummingbird confidence, flicking tails like punctuation marks and leaving threads of blue-white wake that curled into perfect spirals before fading. Sea sprites, the old stories had called them, the reef's own comedians and custodians, fond of pranks, secrets, and inconvenient timing. They circled the star where it rested on Olaf's glass-thin frost, then bumped it with the gentlest mischief, as if testing whether this shiny visitor came with a return to sender label. The ice trembled, the mirror rippled, and Stitch hissed in that whispery way that meant do not touch the calibration. The sprites pretended innocence with award-winning sincerity, then braided themselves into a living ring around the star. Little faces curious, little shoulders shaking with laughter they tried very hard not to release. Moana knelt, steadying the cradle of sailcloth with one palm. The star's warmth fluttered under her hand. Not quite fear, not quite delight. A traveller's nerves at a noisy crossroads. She breathed slow, the way she did when coaxing a skittish canoe onto a narrow beach, and let the quiet of that breath spread into the pool. The sprites noticed. Mischief wavered. Attention sharpened. Kindness, it turned out, was louder than scolding in places that had always preferred whispers. They began the first trick because they could not help themselves. Two darted to Stitch's projector beam and, with more confidence than sense, rearranged a handful of points into a lopsided octopus. Stitch twitched an ear, sighed in fluent exasperation, and nudged the map back into order. The sprites applauded with the solemnity of theatre-goers who recognized a master technician at work. First light joke of the section, delivered by cosmic interns with glow sticks. Olaf, determined to participate, leaned over the edge to puff a fresh breath of frost and slid one sleek inch forward on his own glaze. He windmilled, recovered, and then posed as if the near tumble had been part of the choreography. The sprites adored this. They hovered around him like a school of captivated toddlers, tracing snowflake shapes in the water with their fingers. Olaf, now pronouncing himself an ambassador to the tiny underwater community, offered a grand bow that ended in a small squeak when his twig foot met a suspiciously enthusiastic patch of ice. The reef tolerated all this with the patience of an introvert, hosting a party it had not RSVP'd for. Moana did not shoo the sprites away. Instead, she told the scene with her hands, the way some people talk to dogs or lullabies. Here is a friend from the sky. Here is a doorway that prefers stillness. Here is a clock that believes in deadlines. The sprites conferred in a swirl that looked like tea leaves deciding the future. Then they started the second trick, which, to their credit, was less prank and more demonstration. They skimmed across the pool in patterns that matched constellations, drawing lines between their glowing bodies until the reflection below woke up and paid respectful attention. When they reached the place in the sky map where the gap waited, the home-shaped absence, they all felt now like a missing tooth. They halted, then darted upward as one, breaking the surface and flinging a lace of droplets into the night. The drops hung longer than gravity usually allowed, and then fell back with a sound like a tiny bell. Stitch's ears rose. Olaf whispered that the ocean had just learned to play a triangle. Moana felt the star thrum, recognizing choreography written in the language of water, meaning arrived in her chest the way a tide climbs a little higher without raising its voice. Reflection alone would not hold long enough. Sky needed wind braided into it, a path that did not wiggle when clouds frowned. The sprites offered another demonstration, fanning their fins until a miniature spiral of air skated across the pool and steadied the shimmering mirror. They were saying, with the patient sarcasm of small experts, that the mirror needed a guide rope made of sky breeze. She knew a certain demigod who was intimately acquainted with both wind and showmanship. The sprites must have seen the decision settle across her shoulders, because they drew 3 symbols in the foam that slid along the coral rim. A fishhook, a curving wave, and a feathered shape that could only mean hawk. The foam held the shapes for a heartbeat, then thinned back to lace. Second joke arrived on cue in Moana's thoughts, new but faithful to their running list. If the universe had a help desk, it would probably route cloud control requests directly to Maui and then put you on hold with ocean music while he finished combing his hair. They were not finished helping. Mischief has a cousin called Guidance, and the sprites were fluent in both. They divided into small teams and tended the pool like stagehands. One team smoothed micro ripples with tiny palms. Another traced a faint phosphorescent ring, precisely where Stitch had marked the alignment. A third swam out to the lip of the lagoon and negotiated with an impatient current. And if the conversation looked like a series of underwater cartwheels, well, effective communication comes in many styles. The current agreed to behave for a few minutes in exchange for a handful of sandy glitter and a promise that the show would be worth it. Stitch recalibrated around the new stability, his projector now humming in friendly accord with the pool instead of scolding it. He plotted the cleanest moment for a handoff, when the mirror, the wind, and the star's own pulse would all become one rhythm. Olaf added a sheet-thin glaze where shadows clung, then spirited it away when the water beneath remembered how to be still. He claimed, with cheerful authority, that he was giving the reef a spa treatment. The sprites bobbed like appreciative critics, and awarded the spa 5 out of 5 seashells for ambience. Third light joke confirmed by the very unbiased Reef Day Spa Association. Moana crouched and let the star feel all this preparation through the cradle. She described the plan without words, just palm and breath and steady spine. The star answered with that musical vibration that had first curled into her bones on the beach. Brighter threads gathered inside it, forming, for a fleeting instant, the shape of a fishhook that matched the foam symbol the sprites had drawn. The universe was very clearly nudging her toward an old friend. They paused together, all of them, as if the reef itself had held up a hand and suggested a breath. In that soft space, Moana remembered the calls that travelled better than shouts. The chant that names a wind without chaining it, the way you can invite a cloud to join you instead of ordering it about. She did not sing out loud. Instead, she let the memory of that chant roll through her chest like a drumline made of tide. The sprites felt it and added their own high, tinkling counterpoint, bubbles tick-ticking against the coral like tiny applause. The projector brightened by a hair, Olaf's frost thinned to invisibility, and the pool's mirror deepened to velvet. The agreement formed invisibly above them. Somewhere past the dark shoulder of the horizon, cloud herds began to drift with purpose. Somewhere between island and emptiness, a hawk-shaped idea turned its head. Somewhere in the old weave of stories that hold sky and sea together, a fishhook glimmered the way a familiar tool does when someone you trust reaches for it. Moana touched the pool's rim, grateful to the small architects of mischief who had become, for the length of a single problem, engineers of grace. They responded by arranging themselves along the edge like a glowing necklace and winking in a pattern that suspiciously resembled a countdown. Stitch checked his timing and nodded without words. Olaf wobbled into a steady stance, ready to freeze or unfreeze a breath's worth of water at a nod. Before the next part arrived, one especially bold sprite swam up to the star and pressed a tiny hand to its surface. The glow between them met in a brief, tender flare, like two nightlights acknowledging each other's watch. Then the sprite zipped back to the ring, mischief satisfied, guidance delivered, patience miraculously intact. The air shifted. The smell of rain braided with the salt, not storm-heavy, just full of distance. The hair on Moana's arms pricked in friendly recognition. Above the lagoon, the first curls of a low cloud gathered themselves, bright along the edges, sheepish in the middle, and very clearly ready to be teased into something useful by a show-off who knew his way around a sky. The reef, the sprites, the mirror, the map, the star, and the slow drum of Moana's breath all leaned the same direction at once, making room for an arrival that loved a good entrance as much as it loved a well-thrown hook. The breeze gathered itself into something purposeful, tugging gently at hair, at sailcloth, at the patience of those who had been waiting. A shadow crossed the reef that was not cloud and not bird alone, and then the hawk shape folded into a figure, landing with the confidence of someone who enjoys gravity as a suggestion rather than a rule. The fishhook gleamed even in near dark, its curve echoing constellations that sailors name by feel before they name them by mouth. Somewhere, the sprites approved with a chorus of tiny oohs, the reef managing to look unimpressed, while secretly rearranging its posture for a better view. Dramatic entrance etiquette being what it is, the air added a faint drum roll, a distant thrum at the edge of hearing, the kind a narrator pretends not to notice to keep the bedtime tone intact. Shoulders eased. The star warmed in its cradle. A small ember recognizing the forge, a little extra brightness slipped through the sailcloth weave, sketching a soft halo on Moana's knees as if to say, "Yes, the friend has arrived." He did not waste the moment. He never did. A tilt of the fishhook and the lowest of clouds sidled closer, pretending innocence. Another tilt, and they braided together, pale threads drawing tight, then slack, then tight again, finding the rhythm of the wind that the sprites had already coaxed into cooperation. It was cloudwork rather than thunderwork, quiet, deliberate, humming with that almost sound of ice crystals deciding to hold hands. The first span formed above the pool, a ribbon of pearl that did not drip and did not dissolve, held there by wind stitched to memory. It wavered once, like a leg testing a new bridge, and then steadied as if it had remembered it had always been a bridge when someone believed it was. Stitch adjusted the dome so the projected stars met this new pathway without quarrel. The empty space in the pattern hovered like a doorway propped politely open. Olaf admired the architecture with the specific pride of someone who once proposed an ice ladder and is currently watching a cloud ladder audition for the same role. He announced that it looked extremely up to code, then immediately appointed himself safety marshal for slippery miracles, which mainly involved puffing small breaths at tiny spots where shadow clung, the reef spa receiving an unscheduled follow-up treatment at no charge. Light joke number 1, stamped by the Office of Wholesome Bragging. Moana carried the star closer to the water's glowing center and let the new-built ribbon pass its reflection over the sphere. The little light answered with a hushed, high tremor that felt like a traveler's calves, noticing a staircase and deciding, yes, this is climbable. Threads inside the star braided to match the curve of the cloud. For a heartbeat, the fishhook shape appeared again, this time tilted skyward, a memory aligning with a tool. The demigod turned his attention to the far horizon and gathered more material. A sweep of the hook brushed the belly of a sleeping cloud bank. A handful of night condensed where the hook pointed, arranging itself into a second strand that reached toward the first, with the eagerness of cousins meeting at a seaside market. He coaxed them to kiss in the middle. The seam shivered, failed, then held, like two thoughts finally agreeing to finish the same sentence. He kept weaving. Bridges, after all, are only ladders with better manners. Sprites took their places like stagehands, hovering along the length of the cloudwork to tap it into shape. Each touch left a pinprick of blue-white that faded once the curve was true. Stitch paced the coral rim with intent, timing the slow sway of the bridge to the measured breath of the wind that supported it. He nudged the angle by fractions, until the first span in the pool's mirror aligned so precisely with the projection above that the difference between real and reflected became a matter of politeness rather than physics. The reef's bowls held their stillness like monks holding candles. Olaf's gossamer glaze smoothed any ripple bold enough to consider existing. Moana brought her breath into chorus with the sea until her chest rose and fell on the same long count, the way she had when learning to trust a distant horizon that did not stop being distant simply because you wanted it closer. The bridge lengthened. Its surface was not smooth like stone. It held a texture of bright grain, as if someone had combed dawn through it and left the lines behind. Stepping upon it would be stepping upon a memory of morning. When the wind rose, the grain shimmered side to side in slow motion, not enough to unsteady a careful foot, enough to be beautiful. 1,000 tiny droplets beaded along the edges and refused to fall, pearled praises for the engineering. Joke number 2 offered itself quietly. If clouds ever opened a gym, this one had just finished leg day. The star's pulse climbed into a measured anticipation that landed gently in the bones of those near it. It was not panic, not anymore. It was the feeling of a path revealing itself at the exact speed a tired heart can accept. A bedtime pace, almost. The sprites dimmed their own light a fraction, respectful as ushers. The demigod anchored the near end of the bridge to the air right above the pool, hooking it to the map's projection with a gesture that suggested a fisherman tying a last knot he knows better than his own name. Moonlight took a step back and let the construction show itself. The clouds overhead parted around the work, soft-edged, admiring. Far above, the constellation that had been missing one small voice brightened just enough to be clear. The gap remained, patient, the promise of return carved into darkness by absence, not by want. Moana placed the star at the mirror's heart and held her hand on it a breath longer than necessary, a palm-sized benediction. The warmth that answered her was grateful and brave, and very small, the combination that makes heroes of ordinary nights. Stitch lifted a hand in a signal that said, "Almost." Olaf whispered a reminder that everything was going to be okay in the tone of someone who believes it, specifically because the alternative involves useless flailing. The reef, flat and glossy, reflected the bridge so perfectly that the two structures, air and water, cloud and calm, looked like a single road folding itself into the sky. A hush gathered. Even the tiniest wave seemed to pause at the lagoon's lip to see how this would go. The bridge took one final breath, as if testing its own spine, then settled into a confident stillness. Threads of starlight flicked along its length like scouts running ahead and reporting back in glimmers. The sprites fanned their fins in a subtle rhythm to keep the guiding breeze braided into place. Everything held. And because the night enjoys a little flair, the demigod drew the hook in a wide circle overhead, shaving a sliver from the edge of a passing cloud and letting it drift down as a veil across the far end of the bridge. The veil caught distant lightning that was too tired to become thunder, and for a heartbeat, the path wore a crown. Joke number 3 arrived with a grin. If a walkway could wink, this one just did. The plan was not finished, but it was ready. The star's path existed in both directions now, one line rising through air and one falling through mirror, a stitch that would pull light back into its place without yanking the fabric. The final steps would belong to timing, to courage, and to the weather's sense of humour, which had been getting better, but still liked to improvise. A breath later, the improviser cleared its throat. Far off, the horizon scraped itself with a darker shade, the kind that announces a squall sending a politely worded maybe. The smell of rain thickened, not immediate, not yet, but present in the way a thought is present before words. The sprites exchanged looks, their shoulders making tiny question marks. The bridge gleamed as if to answer not yet. Hold. Moana leaned her weight into calm. The heart can be a metronome for steadiness when storms rehearse off stage. She smoothed the sailcloth around the star and watched the bridge memorize the shape of what it must carry. The demigod tested the anchor points one last time and narrowed his eyes at the horizon with affectionate suspicion. Stitch recalculated alignment windows with the brisk competence of someone who has reminded clocks who is boss and has the spreadsheets to prove it. Olaf dusted his stick palms and announced that if precipitation joined the guest list, he would gladly handle hospitality for puddles. The night thickened its velvet, as if tucking them all in a little. The bridge hummed, the mirror deepened, the star kept breathing, and just beyond the reef's shoulder, the weather considered whether to turn its maybe into an entrance. The maybe on the horizon rolled forward with all the hesitation of a cat deciding whether the box was, in fact, worth sitting in. A single, thin flash unzipped the sky far away, too polite to make noise this far out. The air along the bridge shifted just a breath, but enough for the sprites to tilt their heads in unison. The cloud span wavered for a heartbeat, then straightened as the demigod's hook hummed in a low, keep-it-together kind of way. Moana glanced at the star in her hands. Its glow was steady, a warm bead of focus in the cool air. She wondered if it understood storms the way sailors did, not as enemies, but as travellers you happen to meet on the same road. The star seemed unafraid, pulsing with that quiet, "I'm ready" energy kids have when they've decided to jump from a dock into water they've been staring at for 20 minutes. Olaf shuffled closer, leaning in to murmur something about how rain would be great for the lagoon's complexion, then immediately worried aloud about the effect on cloud-based infrastructure. He decided to be optimistic because pessimism was simply bad bedtime manners. Light joke number 1. He compared the coming weather to free sky soup and then pretended to ladle some into his non-existent mouth. The first touch of wind, that wasn't part of the bridge's careful weave, brushed Moana's cheek. It smelled faintly of distant mango groves and something like metal rain preparing its entrance cue. Stitch adjusted the projected constellations overhead, the map rippling slightly across the water's mirror. A small circle of light widened where the missing star's place waited, like a seat reserved with a folded napkin. The demigod gave the bridge a final, decisive twang, as though tuning a stringed instrument. The span held its pitch. Then he pointed the fishhook toward the far edge of the projection, where the veil of cloud he'd set earlier shimmered faintly. The sprites zipped into position along the bridge, each holding their tiny lantern glows like runway lights. Moana stepped forward until her toes met the cool beginning of the cloud span. It felt like stepping onto firm mist, surprising but not unnerving, like the first time you realize sand can feel cold under moonlight. She crouched, holding the star just above the surface. The little sphere quivered, sending thin filaments of light downward, threading into the grain of the bridge, like a key sliding into a lock it had always been meant for. Behind her, Olaf narrated the moment under his breath, like a sports commentator who'd accidentally wandered into a meditation retreat. Joke number 2. He called it Starball Playoffs, Cloud Division, before Stitch's look convinced him to lower the volume. The bridge brightened, as if the star's glow were running ahead to scout the path. Each droplet beaded along the edges, caught that light, and magnified it, until the span looked like a necklace flung between the lagoon and the sky. The reflection below doubled the effect, so the road to the heavens seemed to rise and fall at once, converging somewhere just beyond the eye's reach. Moana began to walk, slow. Each step set a soft shiver down the span, answered by a matching ripple in the mirrored bridge below. The star seemed to hum in her palms, a note that resonated not in her ears but in her chest. Stitch paced along the shore, keeping the projection in perfect sync, adjusting by micrometers. The demigod stood anchored at the base, hook raised high like a conductor's baton, holding the final measure before release. Halfway across, the wind from the approaching maybe swelled just enough to test them. The bridge flexed. Droplets along its edge trembled, but did not fall. The sprites leaned into the gusts, their tiny lights pressing back the darker streaks in the cloudwork. Olaf clutched his stick hands together dramatically, muttering about insurance policies for star transport. Moana kept her gaze forward, on the glowing end of the span where the missing constellation point awaited. The air grew cooler, thinner in that way it does when you're not climbing a hill, but it feels like you are. The star's glow intensified, small tendrils lifting from its surface like it was already reaching home. Then, the first raindrop arrived, not on the bridge, but in the reflection below. It landed in the mirrored span with a tiny, perfect circle, spreading out but leaving the real bridge untouched. It was as if the weather had decided to knock politely before entering. Joke number 3, Olaf whispered. Even the rain's got manners tonight. A second drop followed, and this time it kissed Moana's cheek, cool and soft. She smiled without thinking, the kind of smile that feels older than you are. The star pulsed hard once, twice, and then, as she stepped onto the final stretch of the bridge, a low shimmer ran from her heels to the veil of cloud ahead. The veil parted like a slow yawn. Beyond it, the sky seemed impossibly close, the missing seat in the constellation now just an arm's length away. The air here was warm despite the rain, carrying that scent of clean beginnings. Moana crouched and set the star down on the bridge's end. It rolled forward of its own accord, light spilling out in fine strands that wove themselves upward. The star lifted, pausing briefly at her eye level, glowing so bright that even the rain bent around it. Then it rose, threads of its light still tethered to the bridge until, with a final, gentle tug, they snapped upward and were gone. The gap in the constellation filled in an instant, and the entire shape shone brighter, a chorus welcoming back a missing voice. Moana exhaled, only then realizing she'd been holding her breath. The bridge began to dissolve, its droplets turning into tiny sparks that winked out as they drifted down to the lagoon. The reflection below released its twin with equal grace, fading back into the calm, dark water. Behind her, applause broke out, small, quiet, more of a good job than a victory parade. The sprites dimmed their lights in satisfaction. Stitch gave a small approving nod, and the demigod lowered his hook with a grin that said he'd known it would work all along. Olaf declared that the weather had behaved admirably and should be invited to all future events. The maybe on the horizon decided to keep its distance after all, fading into the night like it had simply been checking in. The rain slowed, then stopped, leaving only the smell of salt and a sky that felt cleaner, wider. Moana turned back toward the shore, her steps on the dissolving bridge as light as if she were already part of the stars herself. For a breath-long moment, it had looked finished, the way a knot looks finished before a tug tests it. The constellation had flared, the bridge had gleamed, and a sigh had slipped out of every chest. Then the sky remembered its habit of making things interesting. The span loosened an inch, the veil at its far end ruffled, and the small star paused in that uncertain place between going home and being almost there. Moana felt the hesitation in her palms, a tremor as fine as gull down. She steadied the cradle, found the slow tide count again, and let her breath set a metronome the bridge could lean on. Olaf, who had been 2 seconds away from composing a triumphant song, switched to contingency mode with the brisk confidence of a snowman applying for a cloud management position. He declared with professional seriousness that the weather required a light touch and then began coaxing stray droplets into tidy beads along the span's edge, the better to keep its outline clean. One bead attempted a daring escape toward his nose. He negotiated its return with the promise of a better view later. Light joke 1, endorsed by the Department of Runaway Beads. Stitch saw the wobble too. He slid the star chart's projection half a hair to port, then trimmed the dome's brightness until the reflected sky in the reef pool matched the real one overhead like a well-practiced duet. Numbers paraded across his device. He flicked them into place with the sharp economy of a navigator who knows when precision is a lullaby. The sprites responded by arranging themselves in 2 chains, one along the bridge above, one mirrored below lantern lights, flickering in a pattern that said, "Follow this thread." The demigod planted his feet, raised the hook, and called the breeze like a friend you trust with your favorite canoe. The bridge answered, fibers of cloud grain drawing tighter, then easing, then tightening again until each step Moana took sent only a shallow ripple ahead, not a shiver. The veil at the far end stilled, holding open a doorway sized exactly for a traveller who'd gotten a little lost and remembered the way by being loved back into it. Moana moved. One slow, sure step, then another, the star's warmth rising through her hands like a hearth remembering it can be a fire. The span held. Below her, the mirror in the pool deepened to a velvet twin, so perfectly aligned by Stitch's careful adjustments that the reflected path looked less like water and more like a second sky politely lying down. The sprite's tiny lights tapped a rhythm along both spans, soft metronomes for a bedtime march. Halfway to the veil, a gust shouldered in from the almost storm beyond the reef. It tasted of mango leaves and wet stone, good-natured but pushy. The bridge bent, not much, yet enough to test ankles and promises. Olaf spread his twig arms like an enthusiastic referee and blew a cooling breath under the span. A thin underglaze of calm that slid along the grain and countered the gust's enthusiasm. The beads at the edge shivered toward escape again, then decided the view was indeed better here and stayed put. Stitch re-angled the projection another degree. The sprites leaned into the wind in chorus. The demigod's hook thrummed that low stay note. The wobble smoothed. If teamwork had a sound, it would be the night exhaling just like that. Moana felt the star's fear relax into readiness again. She remembered the beach's quiet jokes the first time she'd wondered if the glow could double as bug repellent. The moment the coconut was demoted from the possible star category, and smiled because gentle humour is a rope too, and ropes are for holding. The star answered with a glow that felt like a grin pressed to her palms. It edged forward in its cradle, as if committing to the next footstep along with her. A new, softer obstacle arrived, the kind only tired eyes notice. High above, a thin gauze of cloud drifted across the constellation. Not enough to cover, just enough to blur. The star slowed. The sprites, experts in micro-mischief, slipped skyward and teased the gauze into lace, tiny fingers combing it until the pattern underneath showed clear. The demigod flicked the hook to anchor that lace to the bridge's far post. The gauze flirted with drama, then remembered it had manners and held. Olaf muttered something about adding cloud hairdresser to the team resume. Light joke too, generously tipped by the atmosphere's salon. Moana reached the final stretch. The veil at the end of the span breathed once, a curtain taking stage fright and then remembering the lines. The star woke brighter in her hands, threads of light lifting from its surface like the first strands of dawn pulling loose from night. Stitch raised a palm in the old signal. 3 counts. The sprites dimmed around the edges so the path showed even more cleanly. The demigod's shadow drew long and steady beside the bridge like a guardrail made of promise. 1. Moana lowered the star until it barely touched the grain of the cloud. It hummed in a tone that felt like gratitude wrapped in courage. 2. The bridge brightened under it, droplets along the edge catching and multiplying the glow, until the span looked beaded with tiny moons. The mirror below doubled it, a doubled road, rising and falling in perfect sympathy. 3. Moana released. The star did not shoot or flash. It leapt the way a child leaps from dock to water. After standing for a long time thinking about it clean, simple, entirely itself, it rolled the last inch of the span on its own, slipped through the veil, and lifted. For an instant it hung at eye level, brightness softening the rain's edges, then rose again, threads streaming up like unspooling silk. The gap in the constellation reached to meet it, not a socket but an embrace. The shape settled, not with a click but with a sigh that echoed down the bridge and into the reef pool and into the bones of everyone watching. This time the brightness did not stutter. It held. A new steadiness travelled out along the pattern, the way a greeting travels across a circle of friends. The sprites spun once in celebratory spirals, then flattened into a quiet ring. Lanterns dimmed in respect. Stitch, who preferred competence to applause, let the tiniest smile slip and might have allowed himself exactly one satisfied tail swish when he thought no one was looking. The demigod lowered the hook and rolled his shoulders like a craftsman easing a tool back onto its peg. Olaf sniffed, declared there was most definitely something in his eye, and then pulled himself together to announce that the bridge would be closing its doors for maintenance in 3, 2. He didn't need to finish. The span began to soften of its own accord, its beads loosening into a mist of tiny sparks that drifted down toward the lagoon like fireflies changing their minds about gravity. The mirror below let its twin go with a graceful fade, the way a good friend releases a hug and steps back without making a scene. The veil thinned and disappeared, leaving the sky clean and uncomplicated, a little brighter where the small traveller now sang. Moana stayed where she was for a long, quiet heartbeat. In her hands the cradle felt lighter and emptier and right. Warmth lingered on her palms, an echo of thank you, as if the star had pressed its farewell into her skin. She looked up, found the filled-in point, and knew that some nights end not with fireworks, but with the pillow-soft relief of something returned. As they turned back along the reef, the sprites escorted them like a line of tiny lanterns. One brave sprite drifted close to Moana's shoulder and patted the air beside her cheek, in a gesture so small and sweet that even the ocean pretended not to notice. On the coral rim, Olaf collected the last cooperative droplet, and, with ceremonial dignity, flicked it into the pool as an official closing act. Light Joke 3, recorded by the Reef Spa's nightly ledger under complimentary sprinkle. Oh, the demigod cast an eye at the horizon, found the maybe storm sulking itself into distance, and nodded in approval as if the weather had finally passed its citizenship test. Stitch packed the projector, checked each strap, and then, because he is who he is, double-checked, while pretending not to. Moana gathered the sailcloth cradle, smoothed it once, and tucked it close. The fabric smelled of salt and pandanus, and a little bit of starlight, which was not a thing she could prove, but also not a thing she needed to. They made their way back across the reef while the night rearranged its quiet around them. Behind them, the pool reflected a complete sky. Above them, the filled constellation held steady, as if keeping its own small promise. Ahead, the lagoon waited, and beyond that, the beach where a round imprint in the sand would be a comma, not a period, in a story that had chosen to keep going. By the time their feet touched the softer sand of the lagoon's edge, the whole island seemed to have sighed into a slower heartbeat. The night breeze had dropped to a hush, as if even the palm fronds had decided to take the rest of the evening off. Moana paused for a moment, letting the cool foam trace across her toes, feeling the gentle pull of the tide in the same way one might feel a friend tugging at your sleeve to say, "Come sit, we're not done talking yet." Olaf, true to form, collapsed onto the sand like a snowman auditioning for the role of discarded beach towel. His twig arms flopped out, and he declared in the softest, most satisfied voice possible that this, right here, was the perfect sand angel weather. It wasn't entirely clear whether he meant the air, the sand, or the fact that he'd found a piece of driftwood that looked suspiciously like a popsicle stick. Light Joke 1, now sponsored by Mystery Beach Snacks, LLC. Oh, Stitch trudged a few paces away from the group, his big ears angling toward the lagoon. He took out his star chart device, not because there was more navigating to do, but because habit is a hard thing to put down. The constellations were steady now. The small star's place in the pattern gave the whole sky a slightly fuller feeling, like a smile that had always been missing a tooth but finally got it back. He switched the projection off, and for a second his reflection in the water looked like it was saluting the sky before the ripples blurred it away. The demigod was in no hurry either. He planted the hook upright in the sand, leaned on it, and scanned the horizon with that half smirk of someone who likes to pretend they saw the ending coming all along. "Not bad," he murmured to no one in particular, though the tide made a content little swish as if to agree. His shadow stretched long toward the village, guiding them back without hurrying them. Moana eased herself down onto a flat rock warmed from the day's sun. She set the empty sailcloth cradle beside her, fingers brushing over the faint shimmer that still clung to its fibers. She knew it would fade by morning, the way scents and dreams fade. But for now, it was proof soft, glowing proof that something extraordinary had really happened. The star had been afraid, lost, and far from home, and yet it was back where it belonged. A few paces down the shore, the sprites gathered in a little huddle, their lights pulsing low like tiny breathing lanterns. One by one, they drifted toward the lagoon, dipping into the water and vanishing in small rings of light off to rest, or to tell whatever bedtime stories sprites tell each other about bridges and starglow. Olaf tried to wave goodbye, accidentally flicked sand into his own face, and proceeded to sneeze so loudly that a pair of hermit crabs turned around in slow, offended unison. Light Joke 2, courtesy of the Shellfish Residents Association. The village lay quiet beyond the palms, but in the hush, Moana could imagine the life still moving there. Fires banked low, someone turning in their hammock, a fishing net drying in the moonlight. This moment, though, belonged to the beach. She lay back against the rock, looking up at the constellations she'd learned as a child. Each had its story, its path, its lesson about where you come from and where you're going. Tonight, the newest point of light felt like it had added a chapter to that story. Olaf eventually rolled over onto his side, propping his head up with one twig arm, and announced that he was 98% sure the sound of the waves was trying to tell him something in Morse code. Moana played along, tapping her finger on the rock in a rhythm and saying it meant time for Snowman to take a nap. Olaf nodded, sagely, claiming he would have translated it as bring snacks, but that naps were also acceptable. Light Joke 3, approved by the Late Night Snack Guild. Stitch padded back over, brushing sand from his fur. Without saying much, he sat beside Moana and leaned back on his hands, ears tilted toward the sky. The demigod joined them a moment later, folding his long legs onto the sand and letting the hook rest across his lap. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was the gentle conversation between wave and shore, the slow in and out that could pull a person's thoughts into its rhythm without them realizing it. Somewhere far out past the reef, a faint glimmer rose above the water, the kind of light that might have been a boat's lantern, or might have been a trick of the moon. Moana liked to think it was the star, peeking back through a gap in the horizon just to say thank you one more time before settling in for the night. Eventually, Moana pushed herself up, brushing the sand from her legs. "Come on," she said softly, though her tone had none of the usual "let's move" urgency. It was more like suggesting a friend join you for one last slow dance before the music ends. The group fell into step behind her, Olaf humming an off-key lullaby, Stitch walking with that side-to-side sway that somehow matched the tide, and the demigod keeping an easy watch on the path ahead. The beach held their footprints for a while before the tide smoothed them away. The waves carried the night forward, and the constellations overhead kept their steady vigil, each light a small promise kept. Moana glanced back once, just as the last bit of glow from the cradle faded, and thought not with sadness, but with a gentle kind of joy that some goodbyes aren't endings at all. The canoe's nose kissed the sand with a soft, contented thump, the kind that says a night's work has been folded and put away. The sky over Motunui was still deep, but its edges had begun to chiffon, a faint pale rinsing along the rim of the sea. Moana stepped out first, feet sinking into the cool fringe of shoreline, the kind of cool that wakes but doesn't startle. Stitch hopped after, landing with a hushed splat and an efficient shake. Olaf slid over the gunwale like a snowflake attempting parkour, which looked both graceful and mildly improbable, then posed as if he'd meant the whole slide exactly like that. The demigod shouldered the canoe farther up the beach with a single, casual push, and set the hook upright so it could keep company with the palms. The beach remembered their earlier footprints and tried on the new set for size, laying them side by side like a before and after that only the tide would read. Far above, the returned constellation held its place, not blaring about it, just quietly, more complete. Every now and then one point in that pattern seemed to wink a little brighter, and Moana felt the echo of warm pressure on her palms, as if a very small thank you had been folded between her hands and wouldn't quite stop glowing. They moved slowly because the night asked them to. The sprites, satisfied engineers of grace, bobbed low over the lagoon in a drowsy procession, then drifted back toward their coral neighborhood with the off-duty swagger of stagehands after a good show. One paused to scribble a phosphorescent check mark on a rock, and then wiped it away with both tiny hands, clearly proud of its paperwork. Stitch glanced at the mark, approved with a dignified tail swish, and pretended he hadn't. Moana set the sailcloth cradle on the sand, smoothing it the way one smooths a map after a long crossing. The faint shimmer in the weave was nearly gone, but when she pressed her palm to it, a thin warmth answered, like the last curl of tea in the cup. She tucked the cloth into her bag with the same care she saved for wayfinding tools and lucky shells. It smelled of salt, pandanus, and something that wasn't a scent so much as a feeling like the hush between waves that makes a person breathe slower without being asked. Olaf flopped onto his back and drew an enthusiastic sand angel that looked more like a snow amoeba in a good mood. He declared that his internal barometer, renowned for accuracy, and completely imaginary, predicted a 100% chance of breakfast. Then he found a piece of driftwood shaped suspiciously like a spoon and held it aloft as if the beach had developed room service. The hermit crabs declined to be menus. The palms rustled in sympathy for everyone who was not currently a coconut. Light joke 1, stamped by the Motunui hospitality yet to be invented board. Stitch wandered a few paces to the tide line and sat, knees up, ears tilted wide like sails catching the last cool of night. He didn't say anything about the projection, or the calibration, or the alignment windows he had quietly wrestled into place. He just watched the constellation where the small star sat now, and made a low, satisfied sound that might have meant everything lined up, and might have meant nice work. Sky. Moana bumped his shoulder with hers, a soft punctuation. He bumped back, which in Stitch language translated to "you did good, too." And also, "I am considering snacks." The demigods stayed a little apart, the way the horizon stays a little apart even when you sail all day toward it. He studied the bridge-shaped absence where clouds had been, then rolled the hook across his palm, liking the weight. The air carried that faint iron thread of rain gone elsewhere, a weather note that said the storm had thought about it and decided to be dramatic somewhere off stage. He lifted the hook toward the brightened dot for a beat, an acknowledgement between craftsmen, and then tucked it over his shoulder with a grin that implied he would, of course, accept thanks in the form of future dramatic opportunities. Moana leaned back on her hands and let the beach talk. The waves slowed their consonants to lullaby speed. Sh in, sh out, smoothing the shoreline's breath. The sand held cool below, and yesterday's warmth deeper down, layers of temperature stacked like quilts. In the village, a rooster auditioned for dawn too early and got ignored by everyone except a gecko, which clicked disapproval and then forgave him. The whole island felt like a hammock at that moment, swaying enough to remind you you're alive, not enough to spill you from your dreams. She thought of the night's small ledger of jokes and miracles, the coconut's brief career as aspiring star, the reef spa's complimentary services, Olaf's ice ladder theory applying for a cloud permit, the sprites doubling as stage crew, the runaway beads returning for the better view. She thought of fear, too, how it had curled small at the pool's edge when given a steady place to sit. The lesson folded itself neatly inside all of that, how some problems do not get solved by louder voices or sharper knots but by patient breath. A helpful map, and friends who show up ready to do the odd jobs only they can do. Above them, the returned star brightened one more time and then settled into the sky's ordinary brilliance, which is to say, extraordinary most nights and easily taken for granted. Moana lifted a hand in a tiny wave she would deny if asked. A hush in her chest answered gratitude, moving like tide water, unhurried and sure. She didn't try to say anything aloud. The night had been full of words already, and this part needed quiet. Breakfast would come soon enough, the smoke of cook fires, the chatter about nothing in particular that people offer one another when the big story is finished. And a dozen small ones want to begin. There would be nets to mend, a canoe to check, a chicken to retrieve from an improbable location, and yes, probably a debate about her newest research into beach illumination standards and whether glowing stones count as acceptable lighting under village ordinance. Light Joke 2, respectfully filed with the Committee for Sensible but Easily Bent Rules. For now, Moana stayed with the gentle part, the part where your shoulders forget they know the shape of effort and borrow the shape of rest instead. The star had made a promise in the quiet, a promise not to be loud about it but to be there. She had made one too, without ceremony, to keep showing up when the night asked, to keep listening when the reef hummed, to keep laughing when crabs formed unions and coconuts auditioned for constellations. It was a fair trade, she thought. The world could use more trades like that. Olaf sat up and announced a final judgment. Waves are nature's nap app, and everyone should subscribe. Stitch agreed with a single dignified nod, and then ruined the gravitas by stealing a piece of seaweed and declaring it surprisingly acceptable. The demigod stretched, bones popping with the crisp little music of satisfied work, then gathered the canoe's rope with one hand and asked the tide, without asking, to keep it safe a while. Light Joke 3. The tide agreed, provided it could deduct a small fee in sand. The first feather of dawn loosened over the water, painting the far edge of the ocean with diluted gold. The beach took a slow breath as if to say, "There you are, I thought you'd be here," then settled again. Moana stood, brushed sand from her legs, and turned toward the village where the day would start in the ordinary way that always makes room for something extraordinary later. Behind her, the waves kept their kinder rhythm. Above her, the sky wore a new steadiness. Inside her, something that had been tight became easy. Home and gentle waves, she thought, and the words felt exactly the right weight. The beach, at last, loosened its hold on effort and welcomed the slow drift of after. The breeze barely moved now. It only feathered the edges of thoughts and tugged at the smallest strands of hair near the temple. A soft reminder that even stillness is a kind of motion. Far offshore, the horizon dissolved into pale thread, and the line between water and sky forgot its job, went soft, went kind. The palms didn't whisper so much as breathe. They exhaled leaf, scent, and a memory of sun. And then they were quiet again. Steps blurred, footprints surrendered. The canoe settled deeper into sand, making its own pillow. The reef's bowls, finished with mirrors and mischief, closed their eyelids and dreamed small, bright dreams. Somewhere in the village, a pot lid clicked, then rested. A hammock turned once and stopped. A chicken climbed down from whatever improbable place it had chosen for the night and pretended it had meant to be there. Above it all, the constellation that had been missing a voice kept its place without effort, humming the kind of tune you only hear when you listen sideways, when you're not trying. Names softened, edges blurred. Even jokes wrapped themselves in blankets and became warm corners in the mind. The ice ladder waiting politely in imagination, the reef spa awarding 5 shells for ambience, the beach illumination committee stamping its paperwork with a sleepy, approving hand. The breath in the chest took its cue from the tide, lengthened, and then lengthened again, as if each inhale could reach a little farther out, and each exhale could make a little more room inside. The promise held. It didn't sparkle. It didn't call attention. It just rested where promises do, the way stars rest where sky remembers them. Friends settled into their shapes, familiar as well-loved tools placed back on their pegs. There would be breakfasts and chores and laughter that bumped into the doorframe and apologized, and the next small adventure hiding in plain sight. For now, only the soft part mattered, the slow turn towards sleep, the gentle weight of blankets imagined and real, the sense of being watched over by a light too polite to brag. The waves kept counting, quiet and true. The island kept breathing. The night loosened its fingers and let the morning have the edges, and between them, in the easy, glowing middle, a story finished tucking itself in. End of script. Good night.